When most people think about Florence, they think about the Renaissance, right? Michelangelo's David, that dome Brunelleschi design.
Iconic.
Totally. But the stuff you shared, it's like there's way more to Florence than just that one period.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like Florence was like destined to be important even before the Renaissance, way back in the medieval period. It was already a major player in Europe.
It's true. I mean, the sources make it sound like this insane hub, just buzzing with trade and finance, bankrolling everybody, like from English kings all the way up to the Pope. Honestly, I never realized how much influence they actually had.
Right. And it's that financial power that let them really shape like events outside of Florence, too. The Avignon papacy, for example.
Oh, right.
Florence's money was key to getting that whole thing set up and keeping it going.
Which wasn't that like a super controversial time for the church? Shows you Florence wasn't just, watching history happen. They were in there shaking things up with their wallets. But, it's funny. When you talk about money and power in Florence, you got to talk about the Medici family.
Makes sense. They're everywhere.
They really are.
Now, most folks know them as, like, art patrons. But they were so much more, like incredibly sharp when it came to politics, used their wealth to build this crazy network of influence all over Europe.
The stuff you sent, it really hit home how huge their network was. Popes, royalty, you name it, Medici had them on speed dial.
It's a classic example of like soft power in action, like when Pope Leo X, who was a Medici, by the way, wanted to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Guess who financed the whole thing?
The Medici Bank, I'm guessing.
Bingo. They used their money to literally influence religion, solidifying their place in the church. It's wild.
It's kind of mind-blowing how one family from Florence could have that kind of pull. But speaking of the Medici, they didn't last forever, did they? Like, their dynasty ended in the 1700s, if I remember right. Did that leave a mark on, how power was structured in Europe, or was it just like a historical blip?
Oh, no, it was huge. See, with the Medici out of the picture, it gave space for other families to rise up, like the Habsburgs over in Austria.
Yeah.
Their decline created like a power vacuum that others were more than happy to fill. Shows you that even the biggest, most powerful families, they aren't untouchable. History comes for everyone.
And speaking of history, this just hit me.
Yeah.
Isn't the Italian we hear today, like, based on how they spoke in Florence?
Exactly. You've got Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, these literary giants. They didn't just write in the Florentine dialect. They made it important, gave it this prestige, especially when Latin was still the main language for, like, scholars and fancy writing.
So they challenged how things were done. Again, this time with language. It's like they had this knack for pushing boundaries. Money, politics, even how people talked. They weren't content just following the crowd, were they?
It really shows how ambitious they were, this drive to be at the forefront of everything new and changing. But what I find really fascinating is how this drive, this ambition, it wasn't just like for the rich and powerful, It was like baked into the whole Florentine society, showed up in some pretty unique ways.
And luckily for us, you found some sources that get into that side of things, like the more, shall we say, colorful side of Florentine life.
Exactly. Like one source talks about this crazy Easter tradition. They call it the explosion of the cart.
Okay, I got to be honest. When I read that, I was picturing something out of like an action movie, not an Easter celebration.
Well, it's quite a show, apparently. Picture this. Huge cart, all decked out, being pulled through the streets by these white oxen. And this cart, it's hooked up to the Duomo, right, with this long rope. Then, right as the big Easter Mass is about to finish, boom, they set this dove-shaped thing on the cart on fire.
Hold on, they set a dove on fire.
Not a real one. It's like a mechanical thing, and it sets off all of this fireworks. It's supposed to be good luck for the year ahead. I guess the explosion itself is pretty wild. Can you imagine right in the middle of Florence?
I know, right?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how they even came up with that. Like, I don't think that was in the Easter Bunny's original plans or anything.
Yeah, the history is a little fuzzy on that one, but it kind of shows you something about their spirit, like this love of spectacle, this need to celebrate. It's like built into the city.
And speaking of spectacle, we can't forget Calcio Storico, that brutal historical football, as one source put it.
Ah, yes, Calcio Storico. Basically, imagine soccer, rugby, and wrestling all smashed together. 27 players on each side, decked out in these 16th century costumes. Let's just say they don't hold back.
Yeah, when they say brutal, they mean it. Like almost anything goes. Apparently, it's not unusual for players to come out of it missing a tooth or two.
It's definitely not your average soccer game, but again, it speaks to that Florentine spirit, that
Yeah.
competitive fire, that intensity, the crowds, the noise, the sheer chaos of it all.
Totally. All this talk of explosions and brawls is making me hungry, actually. And speaking of food, we got to talk about how they do things in Florence. Because when I think Florence, I think, rich flavors, amazing ingredients.
And a real respect for tradition. You see, Florentine cuisine, it's not just about fancy meals and Michelin stars. It's about making the most of what you have. Every part of the animal, nothing goes to waste. These old school methods passed down for generations.
Right. And the material you sent mentioned things like tripe and lampredotto, which are those still things you can get on the street there?
Totally. Not exactly what you'd find in a five-star restaurant, maybe. But that's the beauty of it, It's honest food, full of flavor, and rooted in tradition. Real Florentine through and through.
It's crazy how much food can tell you about a place, isn't it? Their history, their values, it's all there. But speaking of moving from the past to the present, it seems like modern-day Florence has got some interesting stuff to deal with, wouldn't you say?
It does. Being a city that's overflowing with history and beauty, that's a blessing and a curse, right? Especially when it comes to tourism.
Yeah, for sure. One of the articles even had a quote from the mayor talking about how important it is for tourists to be respectful, trying to balance, sharing the city's treasures with everyone, but also keeping it authentic.
Exactly. That article really highlighted how too much tourism can actually be bad for a place, Overcrowding, prices going up. It starts to feel like, I don't know, a museum almost, not a real living city.
And we can't forget about fashion. Florence went from like a medieval textile center to this global fashion capital.
Oh, for sure. And I think that legacy, that craftsmanship, the artistry they had even back then with textiles, it's like it laid the groundwork for these huge fashion houses we see now. Ferragamo, Gucci, Pucci.
All those big Italian names.
Exactly. They're practically synonymous with Italian luxury. But they didn't just spring up overnight. They were nurtured by that Florentine tradition, that dedication to beauty and quality that goes back centuries.
It's like you can practically trace a line straight from those old Renaissance workshops to the studios of those big fashion houses today. That same creative energy, that focus on detail, it's still there. But, going back to the Renaissance, one thing that really got me from the stuff you sent was just how much art is packed into Florence.
It's mind-boggling.
Right. One source even said Florence might have like the most art per person of any city in the world.
It's incredible when you think about it.
Imagine you're just walking around, grabbing a coffee at some cafe that's probably been there for centuries, surrounded by absolute masterpieces. I think I'd get a little overwhelmed, honestly.
I can see that. Makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? What's it actually like living in a place that's just saturated with so much beauty, so much history? It's easy to romanticize, to imagine how inspiring it must be to be surrounded by these amazing works of art all the time.
Yeah. But then wouldn't it be easy to feel almost, I don't know, insignificant, living in the shadow of all that?
Absolutely. It's a two-sided coin, for sure. And that's what makes Florence so interesting. The city wrestling with its own legacy, trying to find that balance, respecting the past, but still moving forward. It really makes you think, what would it actually be like to walk those streets every day? To have those masterpieces be just part of your life? Would it be inspiring, a challenge, or maybe even a little, I don't know, stifling?
That is the question, isn't it? And I think it's a great place to leave it for our listeners. This deep dive, it's been quite a journey. I mean, we've gone from Florence being this medieval financial powerhouse, uncovered the story of the Medici family, and even explored these vibrant traditions that are still alive in the city today. We've definitely gone beyond the tourist traps and seen a different side of Florence, wouldn't you say?
I completely agree. Florence is one of those places that sticks with you. Makes you think, makes you appreciate that connection between art, history, everyday life. It's all tangled together. And it makes us question not just what it means to be a part of a city like that, but even what it means to visit, to be, caretakers of its legacy, even for a little while.